Hi, folks. Welcome to this evening. I'm Patty Molinaro Hooker, the director of the museum. I'm happy to see familiar faces and new faces. Tonight we have the acclaimed author Jerry Enzler.
Well, thank you all for coming. I'm really thrilled to be here. I love talking about Jim Bridger, and I loved writing about Jim Bridger. But the talking is easier than the writing, but I enjoy both parts of it. Bridger is an enormously interesting character, and the previous biographies are not really reliable. And I'm talking about Gene Caesar's in 1861, J. Cecil Alters in 1962, and Stanley Vestal. Stanley Vestal is perhaps the most exciting, although he uses the term cussed Injuns 22 times, and some of the time even as writing as the author, not having, a trapper saying it, but he, the author, is calling them the cussed Injuns. Anyway, they're out of date, but more importantly is there's been a lot of new information that the scholars have come across, that I've come across myself. And so I've read in articles, I've talked to scholars over the past 4 decades. At the same time I was working at the museum, I was trying to write a book, and it's hard to do them both. So I retired from the museum so I could finish this book up. And I'm pleased. The museum and this book are my 2 greatest professional accomplishments in my mind. And one of them cost $60 million, and one of them was a lot less than that. Jim Bridger, Trailblazer of the American West. Bridger really has, you might say, 3 careers. He was an explorer and fur trader, fur trapper. He was a guide to map makers and Smithsonian scientists. And he was and he was also a guide to U.S. Army commanders during Red Cloud's War. And then he also was very well known on the Oregon Trail with Fort Bridger, and then developing other trails like the Bridger Trail, which comes very close to here, to the town of Bridger. His early life, I found some things about his very early life. He was orphaned when he was by his mother, died when he was 12. His father died when he was 13. And he got a job, probably, I believe, when he was 12, working on a ferry boat. And it was probably a raft kind of a thing that was going across the Mississippi. He was born in Richmond, Virginia. He was living in a place called the American Bottom because it was on what had been the American side of the Mississippi River in Illinois, which now East St. Louis or close to that area. But then he apprenticed, and the other biographers have said he apprenticed to a St. Louis blacksmith. The truth is he apprenticed to an Illinois gunmaker, one of the most significant gunsmiths in the Midwest at that time. His name was Philip Creamer. And Bridger was an apprentice. And at the age of 12 and 13, and this is also new information, we knew that Bridger was assigned to the Illinois Indian Agency. We never knew where that was. It turns out that was in Peoria on the Illinois River. And he was living very close to the Potawatomis. And the Potawatomis had been against the U.S. forces during the War of 1812, and now in 1816, 17, Bridger is actually living close to them and trading with them and working under Philip Creamer. And that's significant because it's similar to what he did most of the rest of his life in establishing Fort Bridger, mainly as a trading post with the Shoshone. And then it fortunately was along the Oregon Trail and a number of other interactions with indigenous peoples. And I think that comes from a time when his parents had died. He was orphaned. He was taken in by Philip Creamer, but a lot of the people that he had contact with were the Potawatomis when he was 12 years old and 13 years old. And then there came a famous ad that said, looking for 100 enterprising young men to go up the Missouri River. And that was pretty impactful in Bridger's life. I want you to get a little bit of information, or a little bit of the style of the writing here, so you know what it's like. It's definitely accurate and fully footnoted, but it's not overly academic. So Bridger is now 17 in the book, in chapter 1, and he doesn't know what he's going to do. If Jim Bridger looked down the Mississippi River, he could imagine it flowing hundreds of miles south to New Orleans and the Gulf of Mexico. If he looked up the river, he might wonder where the source of the Mississippi River is. That had not been found at that point. It wasn't found. This was 1804 he was born. So it wasn't until 1820 in Schoolcraft took a guess and called it Itasca, which, by the way, means veritas caput Latin. That's where the Itasca comes from, the back of one Latin name and the beginning of another one. But Bridger was destined to follow the chocolate snake called Missouri, whose fangs reached far west into the Rocky Mountains. Bridger couldn't read, so the words of the advertisement in the Missouri Gazette that February day in 1822 must have been read to him by another. Almost every hunter, boatman, and trapper in St. Louis was talking about what the ad said. William Ashley and Andrew Henry were looking for 100 enterprising young men to follow the Missouri to the northwest to trap beaver. Like most who could not write, Bridger would put his X next to his name. Some trappers saw themselves building great fortunes on beaver pelts. Wives and sisters, they saw their men disappearing to a land of Indians and grizzlies, perhaps never to return. Did Bridger sign up for such an adventure to escape the expectations, or maybe even the exclusions, of civilization? Was it to make his fortune, or was it to take the measure of the new land and make it his own? He did sign up to go up the Missouri, and he went up with Mike Fink as the captain of the boat, the keel boat, and Andrew Henry was the commander. And they spent a lot of time on the Missouri River, but it became so contested with the Arikara and others, and the I'm doing a little mental moment here. Next to the Mandans, the Arikara and then the Assiniboine were stealing the horses. They called it the Bloody Missouri because there was so much challenge. So these first 2 years, 1822, 1824, they're trying to go up the Missouri River like Lewis and Clark did, like Manuel Lisa did, but it was a dangerous area, and they were trying to hunt in the Three Forks area. And the Blackfeet had already made a strong alliance with the British, and they really did not want to have the Americans trapping in their land. So they started an overland route and the rendezvous system. And by 1824, they were going across land, and they found a lot of welcoming peoples from the Shoshone and the Crows and some of the others as well. What's it about? It's all about trapping for beaver. When Lewis and Clark came back in 1806 from their 2-year expedition, or 4, 5, and 6, they said there are millions and millions of beaver pelts here. And that's important not only for the monetary value, but it's important because this was contested land. Oregon, Washington, Idaho, those states were jointly claimed by U.S. and jointly occupied U.S. and Great Britain. And whoever was actually occupying it would have a great advantage when it was finally going to be decided in 1828. So this was in economic interests of Ashley and Henry, but it was also in national interest from a lot of people wanting to see Americans over into that region.
That's Alfred Jacob Miller's paintings.
Yes, that was an Alfred Jacob Miller painting. Okay, and this is that one I was talking about. This comes from Morgan's book, and I don't know, it looks like that little jagged here, like 1, 2, or 3 years, that 3, it looks like that was actually the newspaper that was, had a little bit of difficulty printing. This is also an Alfred Jacob Miller image. Is called Preparing for the Buffalo Hunt. But the life of these men, and they were all men who were over here, and for female companionship, they relied upon the Shoshone and the Crow and the Utes and the Flatheads and others, and they had a lot of mixed marriages. And it was an enormous journey from St. Louis over here all the way up to Missouri. They established Fort Henry in 1822. They went up the Milk River. They went up the Missouri River. That was part of the bloody Missouri. Then they decided they would go down here. They went back to the Arikara village, and we had the Hugh Glass incident around here. And then they started going overland. And they eventually went to, there's Union Pass. Let me see, I'm looking at it backwards. South Pass is right there. Yeah. So it became a different kind of a experience for them than being bound to the river. Bull boats were very important. Bridger himself was a boatman, as I mentioned, at the age of 12. But you'll find through the book that he's constantly building bull boats, and he's building them like for the Captain Reynolds expedition. He's building them for Ferdinand Hayden, who and G.K. Warren on the Yellowstone River. And so he did it time and again, and so did a lot of these early mountaineers, and they did call themselves mountaineers. This is a picture called Hunting Elk. And this one is called The Lost Trapper. It's got some other names as well. Imagine being out in this wilderness. Sometimes you're crossing a river. Sometimes you're hunting to sustain your life. Sometimes you're lost. Washington Irving wrote a book about Captain Bonneville, and he described them as mountaineers, and he talked about this group of people. There's a quote: "A totally different class of people has now sprung up. The mountaineers, the traders and trappers that scale the vast mountain chains and move from place to place on horseback, heedless of hardships, daring of danger, prodigal of the present, and thoughtless of the future. There is, perhaps, no class of men on the face of the earth who lead a life of more continued exertion, peril, and excitement." But Washington Irving was a good writer. Where would you be if you were out there? Where would our children be if they went out there at the age of 18? Well, I'll tell you, in the age of when Bridger was 20 years old, he discovered the fact that Great Salt Lake had salt in it. The lake had been seen by Euro-Americans, but they did not know, because they were looking at it from a distance, that it had salt in it. Bridger was the one who discovered that at the age of 20. At the age of 21, Ashley was coming back, in 1825, he was coming back from the rendezvous, the very first rendezvous, and he had $50,000 worth of beaver pelts. And he needed someone to scout out. There's a place called Bad Pass on the lower canyon of the Bighorn River. And there are rapids. Actually, the pass was a pathway on land, but then the river rapids were extraordinarily challenging. Ashley either asked Bridger or Bridger volunteered, but he went through on a raft alone, a solo journey through that. And very few people in history have ever made that journey. And of course, now it's dammed up, so it's not nearly as dangerous as it was then. That was at age 21. Also at age 21.
Did you say the Bear River?
I meant the Bighorn.
Oh, Bighorn, okay.
The Bighorn, excuse me if I said Bear River. This is the Bighorn River. Also at age 21, the Bannocks stole some horses, and Bridger and Fitzpatrick, Bridger was 21, Fitzpatrick was 26, I believe. And so with horses stolen, you couldn't let that happen because they would just continue to steal more horses. And also they needed those horses to get about. So Bridger and Fitzpatrick decided to be the leader of the contingent that was going after the Bannocks and to get those horses back. Now they were among the younger people there, a 21-year-old and a 26-year-old. But so Fitzpatrick stayed back and provided gunshot to the Bannock village, while Bridger and his men went much closer to the village and untied the horses and rode them all off. So he was doing that also at age 21. At age 22, he was among William Sublet's group. There was the first group of Euro-Americans to see what's in the current boundaries of Yellowstone National Park. Now, Coulter, we know, did it way back right after Lewis and Clark, but physically within the park itself. So he did all these things at age 20, 21, and 22. How much had I done by 22? Well, I had gone to college. So it's really kind of amazing, the things that he's done. And I guess it was these things that made me so interested in wanting to learn more about him. What kind of person was he? And I've come to the conclusion that, one, he was a person of extreme integrity and honesty. He was very forthright. He was very loquacious, very talkative. He would love to talk about, pathways. Someone would be saying, well, which way does this go? He would immediately start drawing in the dirt. Or if it was actually in his house at Fort Bridger, he would take a charcoal or a stick with some chard at the end, and he'd draw it right there on the door, saying, now here's another way you could get to Salt Lake and be faster. But then again, you've got family, so I'm not suggesting you do that. You should probably go by the established wagon road. But he would do that countless times. And so many people we know about Jim Bridger because he didn't write anything, but people who did write things, they very often wrote them and wrote how unique it was to see him. They wrote, for example, went to Fort Bridger, and we were the first ones of the season. Bridger was delighted to see us. I'm paraphrasing now. And he was very proud that his children could read and write. And he asked his children to come down and read for these guests in early 1850. And so he must have really admired that. And in fact, later on in life, in the 1860s, he's writing to Robert Campbell, who's one of his compatriots, but is living in St. Louis at the time. And he's ordering magazines and newspapers, and Robert Campbell writes to him, it's good for you as a father to provide this for your wife and your children, mainly your children, because I don't think his Shoshone wife was reading either. And the third conclusion I come to is that he was, I think, in a lifelong search for home. Orphaned at 12 and 13, living next to the Potawatomis, going more than 1,000 miles up the Missouri River, losing Fort Bridger in 1853 to the Church of Latter-day Saints, with or without cause can be debated, and I debated in my book. And even after he was a guide in the 1860s, and his wife had died, his children were still living, he had moved to Westport, which is near Kansas City. When he wasn't actually guiding someone, he was sleeping on the floor or in a bunk in the storeroom of the sutler's store. In other words, he was living in the back of a retail shop, and sometimes sleeping on a cot with 2 or 3 other guys in the room, or sometimes even sleeping on the floor. And he loved sleeping outdoors on the ground. He didn't have his first house until he was probably 37 years old. Now, they would build a cabin each winter, but then they would just abandon it, and then they'd spend the summer, just whatever tent or wickiup they could create. So he's a man who, so many other people went to Oregon or went back to St. Louis, went to Kansas City. Bridger stayed out in the West as long as he could. So from 1822 to 1839, he hadn't even tasted bread. To me, that's the real mark of whether you're in civilization or not. And I think what they really mean is leavened bread, because there was what they called Indian bread at the time. So he was an amazing character, and I'm going to show some more images here to remember which way. I pick it up the wrong way, and then we'll see, but you don't mind seeing more. Well, it only goes one way then. Okay. Now I'm going backwards, now back forward. Okay, now here you have one of the trappers. They're smoking with the Shoshone. You see across from the trapper in blue, you see a woman with a child. There's another woman, another man, I believe. This is called Indian hospitality, I think it is. And this is more just a gathering of trappers. Bridger was quite a tale teller as well. And this person, this is Alfred Jacob Miller, that's not necessarily Bridger, but they would often take turns to stand up and tell some of these outlandish exaggerations about living in the mountains, being a mountaineer, and what happened to them and their exploits. And that's part of what makes things so exciting, I think, for them. So we should be coming to, am I supposed to be pointing it this way? Did I turn it off? All right, there we go. Anybody know who this is? By Catlin, it's painted by Catlin. The figure is eagle ribs. And eagle ribs, and it's like P.O. Kiss. I can't quite get it fully. Catlin said that he was a, oops, he just went to Fort Laramie. Catlin said that eagle ribs, well, can someone just reverse the slide once? Was a pagan, but it was not. He was a blood Indian, and he was a member of the Buffalo group. And he said that he had 8 scalps of 8 white men that he wore, and he was the one who had killed all of them. And Bridger had an encounter with him in 1833. It was the incident where the American Fur Company was following Bridger and Fitzpatrick with the Rocky Mountain Fur Company. Bridger and Fitzpatrick knew where the beaver were. And the new American Fur Company did not, under the Chateau family. So they just followed them wherever they went. And so at times, Bridger and Fitzpatrick, they actually kept fires lit, and then they tried to sneak away with their men. Well, that didn't work. So they finally said, to heck with it, we're just going trapping, and they went into the Three Forks. So Vanderburg was attacked, and Drips was attacked, and Bridger was attacked also. And he got 2 arrowheads in the back, and one of them came out right away in 1833. It was Eagle Ribs and his men who were responsible for those 2 arrowheads in Bridger's back. And that's relatively new information also, that it was Eagle Ribs who did that, and he boasted about it later at some of the British forts. The other one, you'll have to read the book, it has new information, another description of how they pulled the arrowhead that had been stuck in Bridger's back for 3 years, how they actually pulled that out. Next slide, please. This is Fort Laramie. This is, again, by Alfred Jacob Miller. This is as it might have looked in 1837. Fort Laramie was originally established as Fort William by William Sublette, who had been one of the owners of the trapping company when Bridger was pilot for the trappers. Let's go to the next one. This is an interior shot of a picture painting of Fort Laramie. So it was originally owned by William Sublette. Then it was owned by Fitzpatrick and Bridger and several others in a partnership. And then eventually it was purchased, and then it was still as a fur trading post, and then it became a military post considerably later, about a decade later. Next, please. This is a rendezvous, and there's the rendezvous is what they, instead of bringing goods up and down the Missouri River, they brought them on horses and mules, and eventually by wagon. And this is at the Horse Creek, junction of Horse Creek and Green River, near Pinedale, Wyoming. And there is a gentleman here named Jim Bridger, who shows up in the drawing. He's right there. In armor, yes. And it's not a full suit of armor as Alfred Jacob Miller wrote. It actually was just the the cuirass, which is the breastplate and backplate, and the helmet. And the description of 1837 gives you a good imagination of what it was like at the rendezvous and what Bridger was like. So 1837, this is written by a trapper named David Brown. And he witnessed it in 1837. He wrote about it in 1845 in the Cincinnati Atlas. On the right of Captain Stewart sat, or rather squatted in Oriental fashion, was one of the most remarkable men of this remarkable assemblage. This was Jim Bridger, the leader of the beaver hunting parties. He had a thorough acquaintance with the whole mountain region, from the Russian settlements to the Californias, and every nook by hidden lake and unfrequented stream. He's kind of writing like Washington Irving now, isn't he? The physical conformation of this man was in admirable keeping with his character. Tall, 6 feet at least, muscular, without an ounce of superfluous flesh to impede its force or exhaust its elasticity. Could you advance the slide one more? This is going to be a close-up. It's a little bit blurry because it's a close-up of that same image. But there you can see Bridger on the brown horse, and you see the helmet and with the red plume. So he said that Bridger might have served as a model for a sculptor or a painter by which to express the perfection of graceful strength and easy activity. His cheekbones were high, his nose hooked or aquiline, the expression on his face mild and thoughtful, and that of his face grave almost to solemnity. There's another description, this one by Alfred Jacob Miller. The whole plain is dotted with lodges and tents with groups of Indians surrounding them. In the river near the foreground, Indians are bathing. To the left rises a bluff overlooking the plain. In the midst of them is Captain Bridger in a full suit of armor. I said parentheses in the book. This gentleman was a famous mountain man. We venture to say that no one has traveled here within the last 30 years without seeing or hearing of him. William Stewart likened Bridger and his men as if King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. So that's interesting. The Bridger, by this time, 1837, he was 33 years old. He was the king of the mountain men at that point. Tom Fitzpatrick was another king of the mountain men. Advance, if you would. So here's Tom Fitzpatrick. Bridger went west in 1822, Fitzpatrick in 1823. They were lifelong friends from that point on. You'll see that I reveal in the book something that wasn't known. Fitzpatrick, it's known that Fitzpatrick died in Washington, D.C., and they checked into the Browns Hotel, which was a famous hotel in Washington, D.C. on Pennsylvania Avenue, between the White House and the Capitol. But what's new in this book is the fact that Jim Bridger was with Fitzpatrick when he died, and so was Robert Campbell. Advance again, if you would. This is an artist's conception or a forensic perception of a later picture of Robert Campbell. This is what an artist said, well, this might be what he looks like. A friend of mine, Alan, he just did a talk on the Campbell House Museum, and you probably can see that on Zoom. And he has a better picture of that if you want to see a better picture of McDermott. And the next one, please. That's Kit Carson. Kit Carson first met Bridger like in the 1830s, 1830. They were good friends. Bridger was definitely his senior, and but Carson was very, very good in terms of his skills and abilities as well. There's a unique difference that I point out pretty clearly. In 1838, the smallpox had, disseminated, more than disseminated, which means 1/10. They'd taken huge amounts of lives of native peoples. Now, just like today, the United States was not impassioned about, they really wanted to help, and they actually allocated, William Ashley by this time was in Congress, and they allocated, I think it was $12,000 to provide vaccines, the smallpox vaccine, up the Missouri River to all the native tribes. Well, the money ran out by the time before they got to the Mandans. So the Mandans and the Arikara and the Blackfeet were suffering. So 1838, Bridger is leading a brigade, and by this time, he's now an employee of the American Fur Company. There are camp keepers who are working for wages, and there's a whole group of free trappers who are just tagging along, and they can come and go anytime they want. But if they want something, they buy it from the clerk, and then it goes against their account, or they pay for it in future beaver pelts. Kit Carson was one of those free trappers. So they were following what they realized was a village, a Blackfeet village, men, women, and children who were leaving their dead behind. And they were finding these bodies on the trail and their faces pocked with smallpox. Kit Carson, Joe Meek, and Osborne Russell, and several others all said, now is our time. We can get our revenge against the Blackfeet. And Bridger said, no, we're going to go this way. And he wanted to divert the whole group to go a different way. Well, the free trappers protested so much, he went back but wasn't going to attack. But Carson and Russell and Joe Meek did attack, and then they boasted about it at the 1838 rendezvous, how many they had killed. And Bridger, meanwhile, did not participate and ordered all of his men not to participate. And so there's a difference. Kit Carson has always been known as someone very mercurial, a man of extreme action, and Bridger probably is known more as a man of more prudent, I wouldn't say contemplation, but he's a little bit more prudent, and it could have even been his living among the Potawatomis that made him realize there are times when you have to fight, but if you don't have to fight, you don't necessarily attack. But that wasn't the view of some of the others. So that's a unique difference about Bridger compared to some of the others. Next slide, please. This is a painting of Fort Bridger, and it's done by William Henry Jackson. And this is a close-up. It's a much broader picture or image. William Henry Jackson was a photographer and a painter of later era. So Bridger built the first Fort Bridger in 1841. He built the second one in 1842. He built the first one when he was partnering with Henry Frapp. Frabe is how it's spelled, but Frapp is how it's said. In 1842, by then he had partnered with, Frapp was killed by the Lakota. So Bridger partnered with Vasquez, and they built one up high on the bench near Black's Fork and the various streams. And then in 1843, they built one where it's the current location where Fort Bridger is today. Next slide, please. So Bridger, by this time, particularly later, he became very close friends with Washakie, Chief Washakie, who was a very strong leader and a man of extraordinary longevity. And Washakie was not happy that the Church of Latter-day Saints were taking their land. It was one thing for Bridger to trade goods and give supplies to them. It was another to bring in thousands and tens of thousands of people to basically recolonize. And so that was a significant difference between the Mormon approach, and I happen to think that Brigham Young is one of the most unique people in American history, and he was, if you will, the Moses for America, bringing so many people to one spot. Next, please. So Bridger was also a tremendous explorer, and then he became a guide to people. So the top one here is Stansbury. So he guided Stansbury to go from Fort Bridger across to Salt Lake, this route here. In 1849 and in 1850, he did what became known as the Overland Trail. But Bridger Pass had been known about. Ashley went through it probably in 1825. The Cherokee Trail went through it in 1849, but Bridger showed one of the better routes across, and that's why it's called the Bridger Pass. Stansbury, those first two, and then Gore, he went all over the place hunting and overhunting. G.K. War in 1856, I mentioned that. It was a very short expedition. It was on the Yellowstone River. I'm a little bit disoriented here. Let's see. And to the right, I'm looking at it backwards. Well, the Bighorn flows into it, so. Anyway, some of you can see it, I bet, right? Good. I can't see it looking sideways like that. Bridger was finished guiding Gore, and he realized he was free, and G.K. Warren, who was one of the greatest map makers of the 1850s, was traveling with Ferdinand Hayden. Now, Ferdinand Hayden had discovered the first dinosaur fossils in America just 2 years previous to this, and they asked whether Bridger would be able to take them down I should say up the Yellowstone, heading southwest. And they went as far as the Powder River. And then he built a huge bull boat so they could take some of their specimens back to Fort Union. And then Albert and Johnston, he guided them for the Utah War. Reynolds went all over the place, but he was late in getting, in 1859-60, he was very late in getting his maps made. And when the wars broke out on the Bridger Trail and Bozeman Trail, mainly, the maps weren't there. And Grenville Dodge was saying, I have to use imperfect maps and spend my own money to have a photographer copy these, and they were pretty upset. So in the book, I reveal that William Reynolds wrote to Campbell and said, I really need Jim Bridger to help me make these maps. This was like now 1864, I believe. And he said, and I will pay him. And then Bridger told Campbell, I'm not that good to be able to send it by note. I could be at his elbow and tell him everything to put in the map, but I can't just do this by letter back and forth, especially because he would be dictating it to Campbell. But it was interesting how late Reynolds was and how desperately he needed Bridger's help to map that out. He guided Berthoud in 1861, not only through Berthoud Pass, but also a route from Fort Laramie all the way to Provo. And he guided Collins. Next map, please. This is a close-up of the Collins map. It's at the American Heritage Center in Laramie. And this is a very small section of it. And the way it's described, this map started by Bridger drawing in the dirt. Then he drew on an Indian hide or an animal hide, and then Collins took over and actually did the more perfection. And there was a route to get from Fort Laramie, which I believe is way over there, and to Fort Halleck, which is here. And so they went a very long journey here, and then went down the Sybil Creek, and then went back up to Laramie River. And then Bridger, on the way back, had a direct route, just like that. And we think that line was actually put on by somebody else, maybe one of the scholars in 1922 or something in Laramie. But it's a very, very valuable, it was declared the most significant artifact of the year in Wyoming a few years ago. Next one, please. This is the hanging of the three chiefs. And so when Bridger did the Bridger Trail, he had 2 to 3 times as many people on the Bridger Trail than Bozeman had on his trail in 1864. But the Army said, no, we're going through Lakota territory, and Lakota were saying, no, you're not, and they also got the Arapaho and the Cheyenne to help fight them. And then 1866, there was more of that. But so this is the beginning of 1866. There were 2 Indians that were hanged, and then another one that was hanged. And Bridger said, this is a terrible disaster. They left the bodies there, and the body limbs that rotted off and started falling to the ground. And it was terribly, it was aggravating to the Lakota that they would do that and mistreat them like that. In 1866, many of you know that there was a tremendous attack called the Fetterman Fight. On the Native American side, it was called 100 in the Hand. Does anyone know about 100 in the Hand? There was a transgender Sioux. This is just before the Battle of December 21st, 1866. And he comes out, they're trying to decide, well, are they going to go out now and try to decoy Fetterman and his men or not? And it sounds unusual, but it's this man, he called himself a man, but he thought he was also a woman, and therefore they thought he had a connection to the spirits. So he had a whistle and a cloak over his face, and he rode out zigzag, and he comes back and he said, I have found 10 enemies. And they said, no, that is not enough. And so he does more zigzagging and whistle blowing and comes back, I have found 20, and then 40. And finally he says, I have found 100. He does this 10 times. And so the Lakota people still to this day call it 100 in the hand, because this foreseer, or maybe transvestite, maybe transgender, they don't explain exactly, but he wasn't disrespected by the indigenous people. He was accepted as, well, that's who he is. But anyway, this was very alarming that Moonlight and General Carner, actually 65, had those three men hanged like that and had their bodies to stay up there. Next one, please. I was going to go a little bit, if there's any questions about, we can come back to this, but this shows basically the Bozeman trails are here, and there are different variations. The Bridger Trail goes on the west side of the Bighorns, whereas the Bozeman Trail goes on the east side through the areas that are claimed by the Lakota. And that's why you have all these battles here at Fort Connor, which became Fort Reno, and Fort Phil Kearny, and Fort C.F. Smith, the Tongue River battle a year earlier. And so it was all about the fact that Bridger had showed that this was just as fast, and there was plenty of wood along the way, but there was not much pasture or grasses for the animals to eat. And so as a result, the Army, which was really suffering terribly from the debt of the Civil War, needed the Montana gold. And so they just said, no, we're going right through here. So they disregarded all of Bridger's focus on trying to keep peace. And I'll close my remarks with a comment that somebody made at the end of 1866, after the Battle of the 100 in the Hand. One soldier summarized it succinctly, quote, James Bridger was with us all the summer of 1866 up until late in the fall, and then he went to Fort C.F. Smith. So I was looking at Michael Punk's book, is that how you say it? Punk? I think so. The guy who wrote The Revenant. He has Bridger actually at Fort Phil Kearny, and a lot of people thought that, so do a lot of the earlier historians, but there's no question about it that Bridger was up at Fort C.F. Smith when the Battle of the 100 in the Hand took place. If Colonel Carrington and the officers had followed the advice of Bridger, I do not think there would have been nearly as many of our men killed. He told the officers not to follow the Indians and to send more men on escort duty, but they thought he was old and didn't know anything about Indian warfare. When Bridger was then up at Fort C.F. Smith, right after the Battle of the 100 in the Hand, which is around that area there, the next plan was to, and that was December 21st of 1866, was to capture or lure people out from Fort C.F. Smith, and that's where Bridger was. So the Sioux came and they talked to the Crow, and the Crow said, the leader of the commander of Fort C.F. Smith said, the Crows will not allow Jim Bridger to be hurt. And that's the message that the Crows gave to the Sioux, and that's why there never was, during that winter, a very fierce attack on that, because the Crows valued Bridger so much, and they had been trapping and trading with him from 1824, and this is now 1867. Bridger actually wanted to be, new information here, wanted to be the Indian agent for the Crows, and he applied, and Robert Campbell and I think it was General Sherman, head of all the military, he supported it, but he didn't get the job, and he might not have been doing a good job anyway. He couldn't read or write. He could do good figures, but anyway, I've talked and talked. My watch says 00, must mean I'm out of time. Are there any questions or comments or thoughts? Oh, there's 2 more slides. Let's go to them. Yes, thank you. Okay, this is Red Cloud, and this is an image of about the 1860s. And so he was one of the main leaders of the Battle of the Hundred of the Hand, but he wasn't as prominent, for example, as Crazy Horse and like Man Afraid of His Horse. Next one, please. This is an image of Jim Bridger. It's actually a drawing, a charcoal drawing. It's taken from a picture taken in 1850s, probably 1857, and then William Henry Jackson, the same one who did the drawing of the Fort Bridger, he basically did a thing that was popular in the 1870s, and that's to print something at half intensity, print a photograph, and then use charcoal and go over it and trace it. So when you see the photograph, the pants are just kind of plain. When you see this, they look like they're kind of a corduroy. And it may not be corduroy, but you can definitely see the lines. So I found this at University of Wisconsin-Madison, and Jimmy Stevenson, who was a friend of Bridger's, and he was much younger, and Stevenson said that he hunted and tented with Jim Bridger for many of the times that they were out with G.K. Warren and Ferdinand Hayden. But in 1886, he writes to me, he said, and I'm also sending this picture, which was done by William Henry Jackson. And the original is here at the Smithsonian. And he said, I write this from the castle on this Sunday morning because I thought I could come into the castle in Washington, D.C. and get some of my correspondence done. So I looked at that correspondence. I called the Smithsonian and said, do you have that? And they said, no, we don't. And so I looked more and more, and I said, well, do you have this? They said, we have that, but we have it identified as Kit Carson. And so now, then they've changed it, and it says, thought perhaps faultily that this is Kit Carson. What do you do? And so I think that's all the pictures, right? Okay, good. So questions? Yes?
So what did Bridger do from the mid-1860s to when did he die?
He died in 1881. He started losing, I think by 1868, they started noticing some deficiency, although one of the persons with him said he's still probably one of the best shots of all of us. But by the time he was 4 years younger than the date, so he would have been 62 when he left, or 64 rather, when he left the mountains, 64 years old in 1868. Then he went to his family in Westport, and he had orchards. He rode his horse a lot. Even when he went blind, he would actually ride his horse, and then the horse would go somewhere it wasn't supposed to go and didn't know how to get home, and Bridger didn't know where they were, and his dog came back, went back to the house and bark, 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 and the family came out and got him and brought him back. And there's some and I have 2 or 3 new stories about the family. Like there's one story, his Mary Elizabeth said that one of her jobs when she was living at the house and he was older was to check on him 2 to 3 times a night to make sure that his blanket hadn't slipped off, and because they didn't want him to get too cold. So the family took great care of him, and he died in 1881. And then his bones and remains were moved to the cemetery in Independence, Missouri, and there's a wonderful monument there by Grenville Dodge.
Jared?
Yes.
Already, if there's descendants,
Yes, there are. In fact, I think it was 1997, I went to a Bridger Vasquez reunion at Fort Bridger. And there was probably this many Bridgers and this many Vasquezes, and they set up big tables, and you were supposed to come with your genealogy and write it in. They're trying to get one master genealogy with everybody bringing their stuff forward. And then I know the Bridger group has come to meet more regularly at Fort Bridger. There's also a group lived in Virginia, and you'll see in the first chapter of the book, or second chapter, they think that Bridger's probably descended from William Bridger. I think it's William. It might be Joseph, but a descendant in the 1650s or 1660s. He went over during Cromwell's reign and settled in Virginia. So there are many, and I don't really know what Bobby Bridger's relationship is. I don't know if that's been proven or not. The singer. Yes.
Did he open a bar in Westport, or is that a phony?
No, he did, and it was run by his son-in-law, Alfred. But yeah, and it was right next to, and it still is a bar now. I think it's called Kelly's. But he sold it. He started buying land in 1853 and 54, and his banker was Campbell in St. Louis. And there is a lot of Campbell letters in this book, and more that are in the repository in St. Louis. And so he started selling about 1869, 1870. He owned land also in Denver and commissioned Jim Beckworth to sell it for him in 1860, 61. He had a lot of financial dealings. There's things where he would make a deposit of like $6,000 for the value of livestock that he sold to somebody still out there at Fort Bridger, even after he had abandoned Fort Bridger.